Good evening. Welcome to Zoom into Nature Working the Woods. This evening, Dr. Katie Stuble will be presenting her program, Working the Woods, Science at the Intersection of Practice. I am Renee Baranka, the Director of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. At the Land Conservancy, I develop virtual and in-person programming for people of all ages. I'm fortunate to be able to host our programs within the network of conservation properties the Land Conservancy has protected in Northeast Ohio, which totals over 70,000 acres of natural lands, family farms, and urban green spaces. At the Land Conservancy, many of our conservation easements we hold are on forested lands, and we strive to help landowners manage their woodlots so they remain healthy, functioning ecosystems. Holden Arboretum has a valuable resource to help us manage forests better. This webinar serves to introduce you to the research being done at Holden and how you can access it to be a better steward of our forests. As always, please remember to place your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. Please don't use the chat feature. We'll spend time at the end of the program answering questions. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Stuble. Katie is a community ecologist at Holden Forests and Gardens. She and her colleagues in her lab conduct research into the ways in which species interact with one another, how this shapes our natural world, and how this information can inform restoration. Katie has a Ph.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Tennessee, an MS in ecology from the University of Georgia, and a BA in biology from St. Mary's College of Maryland. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to just switch over to screen sharing.
You bet. Looks great.
Does that look great to you guys?
Yeah,
all right.
Looks good.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So I'm Katie. I am the chair of the research department at Holden Forests and Gardens. If you are not familiar with Holden Forests and Gardens, we are an organization in Northeast Ohio with 3 campuses. So I'm based at the Arboretum campus. Sorry, it's slow to change my slides. I'm based at the Arboretum campus, which is about 25 miles outside of the city of Cleveland. We have the Cleveland Botanical Garden, which is our more urban campus, which is in University Circle in the city of Cleveland. And then less well known, we have a 3rd campus, the Leach Research Station, which is in Madison. It's a little bit further east than even we are at the Arboretum, closer to Lake Erie. And that is where we do our rhododendron breeding and conservation work. So we're this 3 campus organization. One of the neat things about us is that we have a dedicated research department. And so if you are familiar with Holden Arboretum, maybe you've been to the main campus of the Arboretum, you can see here an aerial shot of the Long Science Center. So sort of to the left over here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but here's our overflow parking, our visitor center. Around the corner on Mitchell's Mill Road is the Long Science Center, and that's where the Arboretum team is housed. Renee, could you see the pointer or no?
Yes, we can see it, Katie.
Amazing. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to use that feature a lot. Thank you. As an Arboretum, we are ostensibly a museum of trees. So you think of museums, you might think of the Art Museum, you might think of the Natural History Museum. The thing that is common among museums is that there are collections. There are accessioned collections. They know lots of information about the collections. So the Art Museum, those collections are, of course, art, natural history. We're talking about dinosaur fossils. We're talking about taxidermied birds, things like that. At the Arboretum, our accession collections are of living plants. Often those are woody plants. And about half of the research team focuses their energy on researching those collections of plants to really understand plant form and function, threats, and how they sort of do what they do around the globe. The Holden Arboretum, though, is also, in terms of spatial area, one of the largest arboreta in the country. And that's because in addition to having these sort of manicured gardens and collections of woody plants, we also have over 3,000 acres of natural areas. And our natural areas here range from old growth forest to real young forest to old fields to wetlands and sort of everything in between that you might have in this region. And so my team and I, we're exploring dynamics within these natural areas and thinking about, communities of living organisms. I myself am a community ecologist. Sometimes I wear the hat of restoration ecologist. So we're thinking, who is coexisting with who, how do our natural areas look? What are those compositions? But also, what threats are they facing? So what are the challenges that are in our natural areas these days? And then when we put on our restoration ecology hats in the research world, we are thinking about solutions to some of these problems and how we can nudge these systems in directions that we might like to see them go. And one of the really cool things, so there's lots of restoration ecologists and community ecologists that work in university settings. And one of the really, really neat things for me about working in the Arboretum setting, especially an Arboretum that has lots of natural areas, is that we have land and we have folks that steward that land. And so that to me is a huge boon. So we have folks that are out in the woods working very hard to make our forests and other systems as resilient as they possibly can be. And they are doing the work that I can come in behind and research. And one of the neat things about that system is that they're doing things that would actually be done. So it grounds the research in some level of realism. These are also people that really, really, really know these natural spaces. And so they can bring insights that the research team might not otherwise notice and sort of drive research in new directions. And so we're going to talk about some of that today. One of the neat things about being at Holden is we're working at this space where we're bringing these three elements together. And I think it's really powerful to bring them together. So when we think about our natural areas, we're conserving, we're understanding, we're inspiring. And by that, I mean, we are out in the woods trying to steward healthy, resilient forests all the time, using the best practices that we know how at the time. We're understanding those spaces, so we're coming in behind that work and trying to understand the impacts of our actions. And then, we have 3,000 natural acres or acres of natural area, and that's great, but that is our footprint and it is limiting in terms of our ability to, confer benefit in forest broadly. But if we can inspire action beyond our property, then we can have an outsized impact on the health and resilience of forests in Ohio and in the country. And so bringing people to our spaces or going out from our spaces and going to people to inspire action on other forests is a big piece of what we do. And so we might think about what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. It might look like conserving our forests by removing non-native species or by doing some light management in forests to try to boost resilience of those systems. It might look like breeding trees for resistance to disease. And then really important to my team is the understanding of that. So coming in behind that and looking at things like the biodiversity in those systems, the productivity, making sure we understand how those actions impacted the health and resilience of our forests. And then that inspiration work. And so that looks like workshops, it looks like printed material, it looks like folks that can go out to your forest and provide management plans, all of those things to sort of inspire healthy forests throughout the region. And so we are not only forests, but we are a lot forest. And so what I'll talk about today will be primarily forested systems. And this is really a critical system in the state of Ohio. Our forests cover about 38% of land in Ohio, and that's reflective of the country as a whole. So forests are a dominant system and also just really important ecosystem. So thinking about things like providing habitat for wildlife, for conserving healthy soils, for conserving water systems, making sure we have healthy waterways, that Lake Erie is as healthy as it possibly can be. And then, of course, sequestering carbon. So we're thinking about carbons as this really important sponge for CO2 to hold that in the terrestrial system. When we think about global climate change, and specifically when we're thinking about warming, the number one natural solution to global climate change is really reforestation of previously forested systems. So those systems that are no longer in forest, if we can get those back into forest, that's a really powerful antidote to climate change. The second most important solution, and this is thinking about across all ecosystems in the country and across the globe, the second most important natural solution is proper forest management. So forests are really the bread and butter when we think about combating climate change, and also they're a really dominant ecosystem here. So this is a great space for us to think about promoting healthy forests to combat climate change. Climate change is, of course, one of the threats to our forests, but there are many. And so thinking about you know, forest conversion or land use change. So can we hold that forest as a forest as opposed to conversion to another system? Maybe that's agriculture, maybe that's a housing development. But also when we have forests that are recovering from past land use, how can we make those forests resilient and healthy? Thinking about climate change, what does the future abiotic suite of conditions look like? Do we have forests that can withstand those conditions? Thinking about invasions, what are the new suites of species that are going to come in and challenge our forests and other systems? And then a subset of that, a special case that is particularly problematic these days, has been for several decades, emerging pests and diseases. So what's going to crop up on the scene that's going to potentially threaten certain species of trees in our forests, or maybe other plants? But also really thinking hard about how we can begin to define solutions to some of these threats and working with our conservation practitioners to define those solutions. And so at Holden, we're really using our natural areas to explore both the challenges to forests in Northeast Ohio and really the Northeastern United States broadly. What are those challenges? What's coming on the scene? How can we manage these systems to be as resilient as possible? And so today I'm going to talk through a little bit of a suite of vignettes, if you will, thinking about some of the challenges that we look at specifically at Holden Forests and Gardens and how that informs management, or potentially how these challenges might shift management. And all of this work is really work that comes about because we're able to work at that intersection between research and the conservation work. And so we're going to start with agriculture, thinking about the recovery of our forested systems from agriculture. And this is something that's happening a lot in Ohio. It's happening a lot in the eastern United States. And so this is a forest that we call Stubbins. This is here at the Holden Arboretum. Stubbins is one of our older forests, one of our healthier forests. So we can look at some of the trees here. We know some of the trees that currently stand date back to the 1700s. That's not to say there's no human influence. There certainly is in the site, but we know this to be a pretty old forest. And this is a forest also at Holden Arboretum that we call working woods. So this is sort of the other end of that temporal spectrum in terms of age. This is a forest that's recovering from agriculture. It's probably about 60 to 70 years old. And it's a forest with mature trees, but is quite different from our old growth Stubbins forest. And that forest, working woods, is really emblematic of a lot of the forest in the region and in this part of the country. And this is because we've had this huge increase in forested land, which is great. So we just talked about forests being powerful in combating climate change. And fortunately for us, we have more and more forested area in the eastern United States. Over the past century, there's been this big uptick in forests as agriculture has become more efficient and consolidated. Lots of more marginal farmland and other farmland has been released, and a lot of that converts back to forest. And what we also know is those very young forests look very different than the old forests that they're replacing. Look both in terms of form and function, so how they're functioning on the landscape and also who they're home to. So this is an aerial shot of the Holden Arboretum. And onto this, so you'll see, this outer layer in red. This is not the whole of the Holden Arboretum, but this is a section looking at those area boundaries today as they stand. And then you can see these dots, 3 colors, green, blue, red. And those are representing long-term plots we have established over the property. One of the neat things we have here is this really interesting mosaic of land use histories. And so we can look at this today, and all of these plots that we have, all of these permanent plots are forested plots. We can go back in time. So this is an aerial shot from the 1930s. This is in fact 1937, exact same area. So we're looking at what is today Holden Arboretum property. Again, not all of it, but a portion of it. Looking at those outlines, and we can see, so these dots correspond to forest quality, green being high quality, blue being sort of intermediate quality, red being what we consider to be poor quality forest, low biodiversity, high invasives, low wildflower abundance. And when we correlate that to what we're seeing in the past, we see that imprint of past agriculture really stands decades later. So here we can see that our highest quality forests in the 1930s were in fact mature forests at that time. We can look here at our intermediate forests in blue, and we're seeing that at that time in the 1930s, those guys were young forests. So they were clearly recovering from some sort of a disturbance, might have been agriculture, could have been timber harvest. So in the 1930s, they're on their way to being a forest, but they're not a mature forest yet. And then we can see these low quality plots more on the edges. Those are spaces that in 1937 were under active agriculture and were released sometime after and have since reverted to forest. And so at Holden, we have this really nice patchwork of land use histories. And this is nice because we have some healthy forests, we have some old forests, we have some young forests, and what we have is forest that really is emblematic of what we see in the area broadly. So we're looking here again at Stubbins, and this is one of our old forests. And this is a young forest, and this is looking nicer than Working Woods looks. It's probably a few decades older. And if you were to walk into this forest, it would look pretty nice. You would take a nice hike in a forest. There are mature trees, shady, got some stuff going on in the understory, some ferns here. All of this would feel good to you. It would feel like a forest. But there are more cryptic things going on in our forest that maybe on your hike you wouldn't see. And so, for example, if we took soil cores from these, they might look really different. And so looking on the left here at a soil core from a young forest, and then one of our old forests here on the right, you can just see visually what's going on in the soil is really, really different, right? We have this really homogeneous soil here, our old soil or old forest soil, we've got this nice organic layer on the top and this gradient in our soil that we don't see after agriculture. And so as a research team, we went through, we have different specialties within the department. And so we went out and we looked at young forests and we looked at old forests across this patchwork of forest history. And we said, all right, what do we see? Maybe sometimes looking at some of the things that we're less likely to look for. And so, for example, we went into those forests and we looked at the biotic community within those soils. So what are the microbes that are there? And specifically, what are the fungi that are there? We looked at ants. They're sort of movers and shakers in the forest in terms of doing a lot of functions. Similarly, earthworms. So I sit right now in northeastern Ohio. We are in glaciated Ohio, so a lot of you guys already know. This is an area that should have no earthworms. These are all non-native, but really big players in how our ecosystems function. We looked at different suites of tree species. We looked at spring ephemerals. So these really like temporally short on the landscape spring wildflowers that are really charismatic. And so just looking at this really quickly, some of our findings, here we'll look at some quick bar charts. The red ones are going to be our really young forest, the green ones being our old forest. How similar are they? So here looking at ectomycorrhizal fungi. So these are those mutualists. They form beneficial relationships with some of our tree species and other plants, help them uptake nutrients. Those ectomycorrhizal fungi, those beneficial fungi, much more abundant in our old forest. Saprotrophs, those decomposer fungi, about the same, didn't make a difference. Interestingly, our pathogens, our fungi that might cause disease, they're slightly more abundant in our young forest. Looking at our earthworms, again, these guys are all non-native. We're looking at endogeeic earthworms, those ones in the soil. They're about the same across. Our epiendogeeic earthworms, more abundant in our young forest. And so my husband is a guy, he's not an ecologist, he's not a conservation guy. And we were taking a hike in a park, a suburban park near our home. And on this hike, he said to me, it was July. He said, Katie, this forest doesn't feel right. And I said, tell me why it doesn't feel right. It had big trees, it had some interesting plants in the understory. Why doesn't that feel right to you? And he said, I don't know. And I said, is it because there's no leaf litter? And he said, that's it. So we were walking totally silently through this forest that in July had no leaf litter. That's because that forest was invaded with a lot of epiendogeeic earthworms, right? And those guys are pulling that litter into the soil very quickly and really changing dynamics on the forest floor. And that's something we see much more commonly in young forests. We looked at ant abundance. Ants were more abundant in our old forests. One of the most striking differences was our spring ephemeral abundance, way more abundant in our young forests, or our old forests, as were ants, if I said that backwards. So our spring ephemeral wildflowers, much more abundant in our old forests. They do not seem like they come back after agriculture. And one of the interesting things about these guys is a lot of those species are ant dispersed. So ants being less abundant in our young forests, but also like ants, they're going pretty short distances. So these guys are moving probably in terms of their seed movement, 30 centimeters, if they're lucky, a meter a year, right? Like that's a slow process. Looking at our trees, so again, these are forests. They have trees in them. Ectomycorrhizal associated trees, much more abundant in our old forests. These being things like oak, hickory, beech. These guys forming associations with these guys are ectomycorrhizal fungi. And then our other tree species that associate with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, more abundant, slightly more abundant in our young forest, things like our maples and tulip poplars. And some of this points us in directions that sort of suggest some restoration strategies, right? And one of the ones I can see right here is this relationship between our ectomycorrhizal fungi and those associated trees. And we get into this sort of chicken and the egg argument. Do we not have the fungi in big abundances because the host trees aren't there? Or are the host trees not as abundant because the ectomycorrhizal fungi aren't there? We don't know, but one of the things that it does suggest is that when a forest reverts back to forest, or when a non-forested system, an agricultural field or otherwise system that has lost its forest reverts back to forest, and we see the trees come and we say the forest has returned, a lot of those associated pieces are not coming along for the ride, right? It's not just, you know, build it and they will come, put the trees there and everybody's going to come back. It's more nuanced than that, right? There's a lot of things that are taking a long time to come back. And so some spaces, and this project here is not one that I was involved in, but Holden Forest and Gardens has been involved in, is the rewilding of Acacia Reservation. So if you don't know Acacia, this is a park run by Cleveland Metro Parks. Their science staff was heavily involved, also their conservation staff, of course, in the rewilding of this, in tandem with scientists at Case Western and Holden, thinking about, here's a golf course in a suburban area. How do we rewild it? And what a great space to try to understand the importance of these different sort of processes that might be at play. Big disclaimer here, big disclaimer. So forests, very, very slow. So, you know, everything that I'll talk about today is early days. But this is the driving range of Acacia a few years ago, right? So this is a space, though, the former driving range is a space that they decided to reforest. And so you can see all these trees here. But what we just learned is that these young forests don't necessarily have all the other pieces. And they might not have their soil microbial associates that might be an important part of this process. So some of these trees were planted just sort of straight in the ground, and some were planted with soils from forests to try to bring those associated microbes along for the ride. And they are currently being monitored to look at growth and survival of these trees to see if you bring those mutualists along, are you going to have better success in your restoration? The other space that we're looking at this is an old field at Holden, the Holden Arboretum. So this is a forest in the background at Holden Arboretum. And in the foreground, this is an old field. And so several years ago, we planted in tandem with the conservation team about 1,000 trees into this space. Again, bringing in soils from forests to supplement those plantings. Here we did it in a more nuanced fashion where we brought in soils from old forests and soils from young forests to supplement the planting to see, do we basically need a prescription for these reforestation efforts to sort of promote the growth and survival of these trees. So stay tuned for that. I won't give you any results on that today. It's all still early days for the growth and survival of trees. But those are the sorts of ways that we can use the research data to inform restoration practices in ways that we think will be beneficial on the landscape. What we also have in addition to old fields or other systems that are going to go back into forests is we have these young forests. And we have lots of young forests at Holden Arboretum, and we have lots of young forests in Ohio, and we have lots of young forests in the northeastern United States. This again is working woods. When I look at working woods in comparison to a forest like Stebbins, this is, I think I said already, it's about a 60-year-old forest. And I'm looking at this and I'm seeing lots of trees. They're pretty small. They're really close together. I know from being there a lot that mostly they're red maple. There's some sugar maple. There's some tulip poplar. There's not much else. When we look in this sort of sub-canopy layer, we don't see much. There's not many different ages of trees, right? They're 60 years old, 60 to 70 years old. There's not a lot of other stuff going on in there. With some exceptions, we do have really amazing thickets of non-native shrubs. So this is multiflora rose, which is perhaps our most common non-native shrub in working woods. Our second most common is glossy buckthorn. So we have those as our sort of big two non-native shrubs in the understory here. And then not much in the way of spring ephemeral wildflowers, not tons of different age classes of our native species, not huge biodiversity. And so we can put them side by side, looking at working woods on the left and Stebbins on the right. And what I see when I see this is sort of what I would think of as sort of like an awkward teenage forest next to a stately grandmother forest. And assuming that before agriculture, the forest on the left, working woods, would have been more resembling the forest on the right. Many more age classes. We've got this dense, this is a shot in the spring, all these spring wildflowers right here in this section. We're looking at a lot of wild leek that we don't see in the spring shot on the left. And so if we have this teenage forest and we think it would probably have formerly been a grandmother forest and that the grandmother forest is harboring more biodiversity, is there a way we can accelerate the trajectory as people, as land managers? Can we accelerate that trajectory and maybe go to a state that's more close to the grandmother forest in less than 300 years? And so working woods, to me, working woods is many things to many people. And to me, it is a sort of living laboratory where we can test processes that might accelerate the trajectory. Originally set up, and this is what it is to many other people, it's a demonstration site. So you could come to Working Woods, and in fact, as Renee mentioned, there will be a tour specifically for folks at this talk. There's also a field day coming up. I'll give you information about all of that coming up. But you could come and you could see different sorts of management. And first and foremost, this is a space for the public to come. When we work with the state forester, he sometimes describes it as a one-stop shop. You could come to one site and see multiple management techniques and see for yourself, what does that look like on the ground? I will say, for any of you that are thinking that that might be neat, might want to come to Working Woods, I'm going to be talking today specifically about North Working Woods, which is the research plots. And these are the younger part. These are the less high quality forests. We're doing management. It is early days. It's a specific look, right? South Working Woods, which I will not be talking about, is not where the research plots are, was a whole different management system. That's a slightly older forest with a different history, more biodiverse, and had a totally different management system. That's a timber harvest. So if you want to come and see a timber harvest that left a really intact, beautiful forest behind, you can come see that too. It's just not what you're going to be seeing today. The north part, these are the research plots. Again, we're dealing with this very young forest, very low biodiversity, very high in non-native shrubs. Again, really common in the area. And so two different management techniques happened here. And those are really common techniques for this sort of young forest in the region. And that is, you can see on the right, we girdled some of the trees. And this was to thin that canopy. As I mentioned, what we have in Working Woods is a lot of young trees very close together, not a lot of other stuff happening. So the idea is if we can thin out that canopy just a little bit, so we're leaving most of the trees. If we can thin out that canopy a little bit, we can free up resources, promote some recruitment in the understory, get more biodiversity in terms of species, get more diversity in terms of age classes, right? That's our goal. And the other sort of side benefit, there's different ways to do this. We have girdled to thin the canopy. You could fell the trees, you could remove them. We've girdled them because these young forests don't have as many old trees that are just sort of dying naturally. There's some trees that are dead, not that many. And so a standing dead tree provides habitat for wildlife and, you know, really improves that ecosystem. And so girdling was our method. Some of them are now beginning to fall naturally, and we leave them there. The concern is not just for us in working woods, but sort of management in general. If you take a young forest like this and you free up resources by thinning the canopy, but your understory is mostly non-native shrubs, you might grow bigger thickets of non-native shrubs, right? You might not do very much for bolstering biodiversity in your system, or even different age classes of your trees, right? You'll just get bigger thickets of non-native shrubs. And so what we can see on the left is that we additionally thinned, but I guess when I say we here too, I very specifically mean the conservation team. The conservation team at Holden went out and also removed the non-native shrubs. And so because this is also research, we have treatments. So we did, and the treatments allow us to sort of decouple the different impacts of the different management systems. And this is really critical, I think, when we're thinking about messaging that might inform actual management. Is management is hard. And if we're going to make recommendations, we're asking people to do hard things. And so we want to be very, very sure that those hard things are necessary. And so we have a treatment where we thin the canopy alone, where we thin the canopy in tandem with non-native shrub removal. And that's really hard. That non-native shrub removal is hard. And so if you could have a healthy, resilient, biodiverse forest with thinning alone without removing the non-native shrub layer, you'd want to know that. So if this is messaging we're going to be, you know, having, we also want to know that that's a critical piece. And then because research is involved, I said, could you leave me controls? Could you have some spaces that you don't manage? And this is maybe not what our conservation team would do in a forest like working woods, right? They wouldn't leave spaces with non-native shrubs. They wouldn't leave unmanaged spaces because they're doing this because they think it's improving the health of the forest. But if we begin monitoring as a research team and we see this uptick in biodiversity that we're expecting, if we have unmanaged controls that don't have that uptick in biodiversity, we can then attribute that to the management. If we don't have that, it will be harder for us to say that that increase in biodiversity wasn't just because the forests were getting older, or maybe, you know, biodiversity got better with warming, like who knows, right? So this allows us to isolate the effects of our treatment and is a really critical piece to some of the research we do. So here we're looking at a side-by-side shot of two of the treatments. So on the left, we're looking at a control, unmanaged. On the right, you can see the full treatment. So canopy thinning plus non-native shrub removal. And you can see just visually how different those forests are. And you could imagine that that might be impactful in our forest. So this is the conservation folks that are really implementing and maintaining those treatments in the forest. And then the research team coming in behind, measuring, you know, everything from how fast are the trees that remain growing to who's coming up in the understory, what's the biodiversity like. And just a quick proof of concept to say, we did the treatments, conservation did the treatments, did they do the thing we thought that they were going to do? The graph on the left, we're looking at change in canopy openness. So if you look straight up at the sky, how much sky do you see versus how much branches and leaves do you see? Blue here, the blue bar, this little guy, this is our control, the green, canopy thinning alone, orange, canopy thinning with non-native shrub removal. This is 5 years in. So I will say girdling trees, they take a while to die. So we weren't seeing impacts until we got to about 5, 6 years. And here we start to see those differences. So canopy is slightly more closed when we didn't thin those trees out. When we girdle trees, canopy opens up. It's exactly what we would expect. Second graph, we're looking at percent non-native shrub cover. So if you look at the forest floor, how much of it is covered by non-native shrubs? And so we can see in our control plots, it's about 14%. When we look at our canopy thinning alone, it's higher, it's about 30%. Don't take that to mean that this is increased by canopy thinning. Some of that is probably the case, and some of that is there might have been some inherent differences in these plots to begin with that we will back calculate for using our preliminary data. But what's important is that when the team goes in and removes non-native shrubs, we have non-native shrubs, or we have fewer non-native shrubs, but we don't have none. We have about 3% non-native shrubs in those removal plots. So success, they can be removed, but maybe not completely. So my team spends a lot of time looking at the seedlings, like what woody stuff is coming up in the understory. Why? Because that's the next generation of the forest. If we don't have biodiversity in our seedling layer, we will not have a biodiverse forest, right? We need those guys in the understory. So one of the things they do is they go out. I don't know if any of you do any ornithology work, but there are things called bird bands. You can these little metal bands on bird legs have unique numbers. So if you re-catch a bird, you know who it is. We use the same bird bands and we put them on our seedlings so we know who the individuals are. Go out every year. We say, who's here in the forest? We have subplots. We don't do the whole forest. Say, okay, new maple. Is it new this year? Was it here last year? If it was here last year, did it survive or is it dead now? How much did it grow? This is really helping us understand what that next generation could potentially look like. And so it's really still working on these data and what these will turn out to look like. This is Alexa Wagner. She was a PhD program, recently graduated from the program. And so found, if we look at our controls, our thinning alone, or thinning and non-native shrub removal, looking at recruitment of woody seedlings into those spaces, we see recruitment to be the best under treatment, but specifically, we've got to remove that non-native shrub layer. Or else we're not seeing the effect, right? So if we're just thinning the canopy, it's not really impacting our recruitment of the next generation of the forest. It's really when we remove the shrubs. Mortality, not really differing across those. And this makes so much sense, right? This is sort of something you might expect looking at a forest that's been managed or not. If you were a little seedling, it would be so much harder to insert yourself into the system and to survive than if you're coming into this sort of landscape. And so this is not a surprising result. But as I mentioned, like restoration work isn't easy. And so if any of you folks work with non-native shrubs, this is difficult. Like if you were to walk into this forest and I was going to tell you have to remove all this multiflora rose, you would be like, no way, that's going to be really hard. And even if you were like, this year, I could like get all the energy to remove those non-native shrubs, you would also know that they're going to come back, right? So if you don't keep going in and removing them, there will be more non-native shrubs. So that work you did in the first year is sort of for naught. And so that's a really, really big ask. And we're very aware of that. And I think this is one of the really, really neat parts about bringing together research and conservation. So in this space, in these exact same forests, my team has been out looking for several years since the onset of this experiment at the cover of non-native shrubs. And so we can tell you that there are now fewer non-native shrubs. Our conservation team is out there every year removing them. That's why there are fewer. But while our conservation team does that, they're also measuring how much time it takes them to do it. And so I think this is the really like special part of this. So this is David Jenkins. He's been handling these data. He's lead technician of my lab. Here we're looking at shrub cover in 6 plots in working woods. So these are, you know, different plots, different management units. And we can say, you know, blue is before management and then black is after management. First things first, we see huge variability in initial non-native shrub cover, right? So we can see that being as low as maybe 5% non-native shrub cover to, you know, a high of maybe 34% non-native shrub cover. So big variability, but when it is managed, so again, blue is pre-management, once it's managed, we can keep it down. Conservation can keep it down. And they can keep it down to about 3%. So it's not gone, but it is much less abundant. So that's good news. But again, they're out there managing it every year. As I said, there's this sort of general knowledge that if you're going to remove non-native shrubs, it's going to be hard And then it is going to be a long-term commitment. It's sort of like a marriage. It's like, okay, here's this project. I'm going to commit to it, and it is going to be 4 years. And so it can be really powerful and empowering if we can let people know what to expect in that process. And so this was really interesting for us as well. So we looked at that time that our conservation team spent on that management. We measured that as person hours. So there were crews of people that would go out, maybe 3, 4 people. How many person hours was spent in the plot removing the non-native shrubs? Just for your knowledge, these plots were 50 meters by 100, so they're half-hectare plots. And we can see, looking through time, that's variable. That's not surprising across plots, because we know that we had different levels of non-native shrubs to begin with. So it could be as low as just over 10 hours. It could be over 40 person hours for that year, right? So that's a pretty big commitment. But what we can also see now is that that goes down substantially. So by the end, we're talking about much less time. We're talking about 1 hour. We're talking about 4 hours for the year in managing that half-hectare plot. And so if you can tell people a priori, this is a really critical part of management, and it has to be sustained, but it will be much less over time. That is something that maybe people are willing to do. And we can also look at this. Can we predict how much time it would be based on the cover of non-native shrubs? If you have more non-native shrubs, sometimes I love what I think of as like the science of duh, but sometimes you just need to quantify it, put numbers on it. And so we could say, okay, this is year 1 and this is year 5. These are person hours. How many person hours had to go into the maintenance of that plot, given the initial shrub cover? So before any management happened, there was certain shrub cover. In year 1, that positively correlated. Again, not surprising. The more non-native shrub cover you had, the more time you spent removing it. Year 5, that's also the case. That's a little surprising to me, because all of the plots are quite low in non-native shrub cover, but there's still that signal of the initial density of non-native shrubs, that positive correlation. 5 years ago, plots that had more non-native shrub cover still take more time to manage. But if you look at this x-axis or the y-axis, here we're going from 0 to 50 hours, and here we're going from 0 to 6 hours. So we've brought that down by an order of magnitude, right? It's tenfold less difficult to do it in year 5 than it was in year 1. And so I think these are the sorts of management insights that can come out of a space like Holden Forests and Gardens, where researchers are working in tandem with conservation practitioners to really quantify some of the efforts and some of the outcomes to sort of empower people to be able to manage their own properties. And so we sort of use working woods to unpack, what's going on in the forest, what's going on in the forest understory, and making recommendations for best practices in land management, but really also understanding, how management might change what our forest looks like into the future. And so we talked about Ohio being about 38% forest. And so we can see that that forest concentrated more heavily on the eastern part of the state, where the abundance of forest is even higher. But also, and this is unique to the eastern United States, very different in the western United States, 85% of these forests are privately held. So this isn't a system where we can make a federal policy and then all the federal land is managed in that way, right? We can define best practices, but then it's really capturing the hearts and minds of individuals that are stewarding their own forests, and helping empower them to make decisions on their land that are going to make for resilient forests. And so I've shown you Working Woods. Working Woods is a public demonstration. It is a living laboratory. We're now shifting, sort of expanding into what we're thinking of as the Working Woods Resource Hub. And this is going to bring a lot of resources together under the umbrella of Working Woods. And one of the really neat things it's going to bring, and look for this in the next year, is consulting foresters. And those are folks that can leave our property to go out to individual people's forests and help them start to envision what a managed forest might look like for them. And it looks really different for everybody, right? There's all sorts of things you can manage for. There's all sorts of ways you can manage a forest. There's all sorts of benefits you can get out of that. And so helping sort of define a pathway that might be appropriate for your forest or for your individual needs, having folks that can help you walk through that process. Again, those foresters are probably coming on in the next year. If you're interested, you can look up the Working Woods website at the Holden Arboretum, and you can fill in some information to get on our newsletter. And so as that rolls out and as we're ready to accept landowners into the program, all of that will be sort of rolled out to folks that are on that mailing list. In the near term, and so Renee can put this somewhere where you guys can access this. She mentioned there will be a tour in June on a Friday, just for folks that were attending this talk. If you want sort of a bigger suite of things to learn about Working Woods and some hands-on stuff that's happening, there's also the Working Woods Field Day. So this is a day when you can come out, sort of open the whole day and intersect with different activities, different sorts of tours. It's June 1st, it's a Saturday. As I said, all day, requires registration. This flyer should come out to y'all and also could be found on the Working Woods website. And so we talked a lot about, you know, post-agricultural forests. Those forests often have non-native species. We talked a lot about non-native shrubs. Garlic mustard is another sort of interesting forest invader that is really vexing to lots of forests in the region, including our own. It's important for lots of reasons. It sort of thwarts our native plant communities. And because of that, it's an invader that really invades forested systems and impacts biodiversity in ways that are important. And so a lot of effort goes into the management of this species, not just at Holden where it does, but really in all the sorts of spaces where garlic mustard grows throughout the region, throughout the country. And so our team, as I mentioned, spends a lot of time removing garlic mustard, our conservation team. Becca Troutman is our natural areas biologist and is heavily involved in a lot of that management work, is a real garlic mustard pro. And so in 2021, she was pulling garlic mustard at Holden, and she noticed that the garlic mustard looked to her to be unwell. And as somebody with lots of experience with garlic mustard and management, this was unusual. It looks usually like a really robust plant. Didn't look very good that year. And when she looked more closely, and you can sort of see what she saw here, she saw this black stuff on it. When she looked even closer, she said, oh my gosh, those are aphids. And so she specifically sent some samples of these aphids off to the University of Illinois to some entomologists who identified it. Doris Lagos Cutts was the one that identified this as, maybe not surprising, the garlic mustard aphid. Garlic mustard, the plant, is native to Europe. Garlic mustard aphid is a garlic mustard specialist, as the name might imply, also native to Europe. What was interesting was this was the first observation of the garlic mustard aphid in North America. And that seemed important, right? We have an invasive species. We now have a specialist on that invasive species, also invasive, now making our plants look sick, plants that we're trying to remove. So all of this is something we were really excited to unpack. So as I said, Becca said, those plants don't look healthy. What does that mean? That meant when we looked at them, you can see the leaves looking wrinkled and puckered. Here you can sort of see this is a seed pod. They're typically straight. They were twisted. And so this looking like an unhealthy plant. A couple questions came up right away. They look unhealthy. Are they unhealthy? Are the plants sort of being damaged by these aphids in some way that we can quantify? And is the aphid just at the Holden Arboretum, right? So this is the first observation in the United States. Is it just here, really localized? Is it more widespread? So I have a second flyer, hopefully Renee can send out. This is a part where we sort of called on folks, and we are still asking for help with this. The first thing we did was have the species garlic mustard aphid added to a something called EdMaps. It's a free app. You can put it on your phone, and it's specifically designed to track the emergence of non-native species. And so we put it onto EdMaps, and then we pushed it out through a whole bunch of different channels and said, hey, if you're somebody that interfaces or interacts with garlic mustard, could you please take a look while you're looking at the garlic mustard and see if there's the aphids? And then we want to know, did you see garlic mustard and it didn't have the aphid? Did you see garlic mustard and it did have the aphid? So that we can begin to understand the distribution of this species. Again, just at Holden, more widespread. And so this app, the app was already there. The aphid got put on in 2022, the year after we first saw the aphid here. And instantly, this is that 22 update on the map. It's everywhere, right? It goes from the East Coast, Connecticut, all the way into Minnesota. This is not reflective of garlic mustard range, though, which is much larger. So again, like if you're somebody that interfaces with garlic mustard, we would love to have you get the EdMaps app and sort of enter your observations into that, really help us out. But what we saw was, okay, this isn't just a Holden thing. This is really widespread. It's probably been here for a little while. Widespread. Aphids are just sort of like, I don't know, it's not like a new snake. It's like really exciting. Aphids, I think, often get overlooked. And so just hadn't been noted on the record officially. So this is what that flyer looks like. Shook them around. The backside has really a flow chart of how to make an observation. And then the other thing that we did was say, okay, they don't look great. Are they really not doing great? And so we have a whole suite of different data. I'll just show you a little bit of that. This is Kaylin Ingerman. She's currently a fellow here at Holden that's been working up these data, looking at, plants. So these are plants that we collected in the wild here at Holden, either with aphids or without aphids, looking at all sorts of different metrics that might help us get a feel for what's going on with these plants. We can see that above ground biomass was reduced when the plants were infested with the aphids. Plants were shorter, so different numbers of leaves. So these were less robust plants when they had the aphid. In addition, Becca noted that the pods were twisted. We quantified those. Twisted pods, much, much, much more abundant on plants with aphids. Those pods on plants with aphids produce fewer seeds, and those seeds are smaller. So there also seems like there could potentially be fitness consequences of these aphids. So we have these plants that are less robust when we find them with aphids, and they make fewer and smaller seeds. One thing that we do see that I'm not showing here is that when we looked at the germination rates of those seeds that come from plants with aphids, we don't see a difference. So those seeds that are produced seem to germinate just as well. And we're growing up some of those plants right now to look at the next generation to see if we see any signal of aphids on the mother plant on the offspring. So that's going on in our growth chambers right now. And so this is really, really early days of study. We're seeing some evidence, as I said, less robust, less fit plants. And so the question becomes, is this going to influence garlic mustard populations on the landscape? And if it does that influence how we go about managing those? And all of those open questions, we're still doing a lot of active research in this space. Another species, so for those of you that are in Northeast Ohio, almost certainly familiar with beech leaf disease, now spreading pretty rapidly. So other parts of the Northeastern United States, you might also be familiar. This is a pretty significant disease, thinking along the lines of emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, in terms of its ability to restructure our forests, thinking about chestnut blight and the past. So a significant new pest on the landscape that might be restructuring our forest. Again, when we're thinking about folks that are out in the forests, really watching and informing what's going on. This is John Pogojnik. He works at Lake Metro Parks, and he was the first one in 2012 to discover something that looked unusual on beech trees in the parks. And so I'm sitting right now at the Holden Arboretum. We are in Lake County. Lake Metro Parks also in Lake County. This is the epicenter for beech leaf disease. And what he saw when he looked at beech leaves was this light sort of banding on the leaves, this sort of chevron pattern. Otherwise looked okay, but this was unusual and this was new. And that set off this sort of whirlwind of research. This is David Burke. He was a big part of that research. He is the vice president for research and conservation here at Holden Forest and Gardens. A big slurry of research to really try to understand what's causing this banding pattern on beech trees. And over the years, progressively, these trees were looking worse and worse. And what they found through this research is that symptomatic trees are associated with a nematode. This is a picture of that nematode, Litholenchus crenata. Seems to have come from Japan. It has been seen before in Japan on beech trees. In Japan, Japanese beech that do not become very sick when they're infected with these nematodes, unlike the trees here. These nematodes seem to burrow into the leaf bud. They can overwinter in the leaf bud of beech. The leaves open up in the spring, as is happening now, and you'll see that banding pattern here. So for those of you that are not here, also in Northeast Ohio right now, I'm sitting here in Lake County in this sort of yellow color. This is a county level map produced by Cleveland Metro Parks. They're really monitoring in tandem with some other organizations, Forest Service, some Canadian officials, monitoring the spread of this disease across the continent, displaying that in a county level map. Lake County, ground zero, 2012, first seen. Here in red, the outermost counties, first seen in 2023. So this was the map that came out in the end of 2023. So really active spread right now, still really quick spread, a really significant disease. I showed you the light banding. Some of you may have seen it if you're in this region, that light banding. More and more, the leaves look like this on more impacted plants. They're thickened, leathery leaves. We know that they have lower stomatal density, they have lower photosynthetic rates, they might drop those leaves. And so really unhealthy plants. One of the benefits of being at a place like Holden is we have capacity to do a lot of long-term monitoring, long-term research. And so here, looking not at a beech tree, but in a long-term plot, we can harness the power of those data that predate me. David Burke setting up plots starting in 2011. This is before the emergence of beech leaf disease. This plot in Cuyahoga County, where it first arrived in 2014. We can look at the survival and death of beech trees in those plots. Very, very steady at the beginning. Here's the arrival. Here's the onset of heavy symptoms in the plot. And here you can see death. These are the number of dead trees. New in that year in light gray, black is previous. You can see this exponential curve of death in those trees. Much more pronounced in the young trees and the saplings, fewer big trees just in general. And those trees not dying quite yet, but here we're looking at the base, we're looking up a beech tree. You can see that dramatic thinning in the canopy. Will that tree die? I can't say. Maybe yes, maybe no. It doesn't look good. Will it impact the understory? For sure. There's a thinning that's happening in our forest right now, and we see that impact in the understory. It doesn't always look like this, but here's the site where we see this big thicket of seedlings coming up. Here, looking at a lot of tulip poplar, there's sort of this sea of tulip poplar in this site that is thinned as a result of beech leaf disease. And so what do we do in terms of management? And so that's something we're having conversations with our conservation team about right now, is if we can see this coming, what can we do right now to get ready to make sure that we can maintain healthy and resilient forests? And so just sort of to wrap that up, we talked through some vignettes of some challenges that we have, thinking about agricultural land use, thinking about non-natives like our shrubs and our garlic mustard, thinking about emerging pests and diseases, also a form of non-natives. All of these are challenging our system, and all of these we need management actions to sort of help maintain healthy forests in the face of these. But also some of these are things that might feed back and change the management that we're doing. And so it's this constant conversation that we have between research and conservation that helps us sort of promote our healthy and resilient forests in the system. And so this is work that, of course, takes a huge amount of effort across teams, conservation, and research, and really draws those elements together to make bigger insights that can help support our systems. And so just as a quick plug, as I mentioned, Saturday, June 1st, there's the field day, see Working Woods, do a lot of sort of deep dives into some of the different forest management strategies that you might be interested in. Or just for this group, there'll be a 2-hour tour of Working Woods where we'll sort of explore what does forest management look like on the landscape, looking at some of the older forests, looking at our very young forests, and talking through those systems. And so I will leave it there, 1 minute over time. I'd be happy to take any questions that there might be.
Thanks so much, Katie. I appreciate you covering the beech leaf disease. That's one that I was hoping to get on the radar this year. And it's great that folks are going to be able to report it if they find it. So I have a question for you, though. I'm probably going to say the word wrong, but it was the it's
Epyendogic.
endogeaic. Okay. The worms, they were in the young forest. You didn't find them so much in the older forest. Any concern about them moving into the older forest?
Yeah, I mean, there's always concern about that. In general, we just see across the board in our non-native species, much more abundance in our young forests. And there's just, less of a resilient system to sort of combat these things. We see lots of invasive species sort of sneak into our old forests, and they tend to just be at lower abundances, but that's not to say they can't come through. Some of the worst of the worms that'll come through move through so quickly and then sort of exhaust all the resources and move on out. And sometimes we can just wait them out, and you'll see that happen in lawns, and you'll see that happen in forests. You'll be like, oh no, here they come, but then there they go. So
yeah,
they're a little bit different than some of our invasive plants in some cases.
Okay. The aphids on the garlic mustard, are they specialists on garlic mustard?
Supposedly.
Okay.
That's a good question. I'll stop sharing my screen. That's a good question, and we are not prepared to answer that for North America yet. We haven't done any sort of trials on other species, and that's something that we might do in the future. And if anybody were to ever think about this as a biocontrol agent, it would have to be done. Right now, there's just sort of opportunistically here, but that is the next step if we were actually thinking about this as a control agent.
Okay. Of course, this question has to come up. Does Holden have any studies on the effects of deer in our forests?
We have a lot of deer exposures. And so we do explore the impacts of deer. None of my research does explicitly explore the impacts of deer. So I don't want to talk too much because I will probably state the research incorrectly. But one of the things we fail to find again and again is a huge impact of deer. And that's because unlike a lot of other spaces, especially suburban spaces, suburban parks, which are really having an overabundance of deer, our deer herd is much closer to the historic normal levels, and that's very purposeful for us. So we do some management of the deer to maintain them at relatively low levels. And so when we do put up the exclosures, we don't see huge impacts in and out. I know there are spaces where you won't see any trillium because the deer sort of take them all out, and we have trillium here. We have seedlings, woody seedlings that might otherwise be eaten by deer. So they're not hugely problematic. We see nuanced impacts of deer. Sometimes we see like interactions between deer and earthworms to impact the plant community. So there's like some nuanced stuff going on, but it's not like some other systems where they totally like reframe or like restructure the understory plant community.
Okay. Question about the beech leaf disease. Can anything be done if you have it in your forest on your beech trees?
Yeah. Shoot. my colleague that studies this more would be better to answer that. They are
Okay.
testing
Well,
several different solutions. Whether any of them are commercially available yet, I cannot speak to that. One of the interesting things, so the plots I showed were the long-term data and sort of followed them through. The like many layers of research happening on that I didn't sort of get into is that those plots are there because they are historically an acid rain experiment. That's basically the experiment backs up the impacts of acid rain. So our forests are impacted by acid rain, and the experimentation sort of like removes some of those influences. One of the treatments makes phosphorus more available. So lots of phosphorus added to the plots. And we see lower mortality and faster growth rates in the face of beech leaf disease in the high phosphorus plots. So somehow the phosphorus seems to be protective on some level. We don't know the mechanism.
okay.
We're not in a space where we would say that's a recommendation, but it's something that we see and we will be exploring. It's going to be coming out in a publication in the next year, hopefully.
Okay, great. There's a question about one of your photos, and it was early on in the program. It was the first photo you showed of the old forest. They're curious what the plant was growing on the ground, and they asked
Wild
if it was
leek.
they asked if it was ramps. So
It is.
I couldn't
It is.
remember. So yes, it is ramps. Whoever asked that question.
Good eye. Yeah, it's a big plot of ramps.
And then I don't know if you could go back in your program to the map of the explosion of the beech leaf disease across the county level.
Yeah, sure thing.
I think, Sue, you might be looking at the map wrong. So we're going to go back and look at it together and try to figure this out. She noticed that the counties next to Lake County were also white, but I believe it was because they also identified beech leaf disease the same year as Lake County. It wasn't that they never had beech leaf disease in those counties.
I clicked on the map, so either it's going to take a really long time or I need to click on it again. I'm kind of waiting.
Oh, it's okay.
Oh, no, it's going to go.
There it is.
Okay.
Yeah, there it is.
So
Yeah,
here we are here in Lake County,
Okay.
and these are the 2013 color. It's a similar color,
Okay.
but it's
It is.
different.
Okay.
Yeah, so 2013 and then 2014 Cuyahoga County. So
Okay.
Ashtabula and Geauga are 2013.
Sure. Okay. So all the counties surrounding Lake County have had beech leaf disease discovered within them.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Not great, but it answers her
Truth.
question.
Truth. Yeah. Sad, but true.
Well, listen, Katie, this was very interesting. I look forward to coming out and getting to tour the Working Woods on June 7th. And tomorrow I'll do a little follow-up email with everyone, and I'll share that link so folks can register, even though I've already seen that some people have already registered for it. So I appreciate you taking time to chat with us tonight, Katie, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Amazing. Thank you. And we'll see some of you in June.
Sounds good. Take care, Katie.
Bye.